1st of December 1996. A 24-year-old man lies by the side of a car on a country lane outside Birmingham. He's been stabbed and is close to death.
The damage to his throat was immense. I've never seen anything like it.
Within hours, police begin a murder hunt for two men whom it's believed have committed the crime.
Very quickly, the phrase that came out was road rage.
What a tragedy it was, you know, to a young couple on the way home from a night out being attacked like this.
But within days, detectives suspect the killer is closer to the victim than anyone had at first thought.
His head turns in slow motion, like this. I mean, it was extraordinary.
There are details given here that just don't seem to add up.
This was a well thought through, sophisticated defence by a very accomplished liar.
And what they uncover is a tissue of lies, masking a volatile relationship with history of violence.
The foundation of the relationship in many ways on both parts was an element of jealousy.
He was infatuated with her. I think the expression was, by both of them, can't live with you, can't live without you.
This is the story of Tracie Andrews and Lee Harvey, the intensity of their relationship, and how that intensity would lead to tragedy.
You knew from the very first this was going to be a big, big story.
The scene that police from Redditch encountered late on the evening of December the 1st, 1996, resembled something from a television crime series. A man covered in blood lay dead in the middle of a country lane, his distraught girlfriend at his side. The victim was Lee Harvey, a 24-year-old bus company worker, and he'd been assaulted and stabbed by two men after he chased them in his car following a heated argument. But police soon established that all was not what it seemed.
Lee, by all accounts, was a good dad. He had a young daughter called Danielle, and he got on well with Danielle's mum, even though they weren't together anymore. He spent a lot of time with her. He was a very family-orientated man, basically. He just stayed where he grew up and was very close to all his family.
His mother had her own hairdressing business. I think father was a driver, honest, respectable, hard-working people.
He was tall, handsome, dark-haired, and used to turn women's heads.
Lee met Tracie Andrews in a nightclub in Birmingham in 1994. It was an immediate attraction for both of them.
She was a barmaid, she was young, sense of fun, she's described as quite an adventurous spirit. In many ways, typical of any young female at the time, happy-go-lucky, very, very normal.
She loved going out clubbing, she loved being out with her mates, she loved dancing. Above all, she loved looking good, and she would, from late teenage years, she was known as someone who would walk down the road in a skimpy top and a short skirt on the high heels, and all the men would just turn and stare.
I think she had ambitions to be a model. She'd done some modelling, she'd modelled hair extensions for a local hair salon. But I think she was quite damaged as a person because her father had walked out when she was 8. So I think that was obviously a big blow for her, as it is for any child, but she couldn't put that behind her, and I think she kind of felt let down by a lot of men and made her very insecure.
She needed this attention. It was like a deep need within her to bolster her insecurities by securing all this male attention. They were in many ways two sides of the same coin. They both felt that they looked good with each other. They made a striking couple. They did make a striking couple, And that was one of the early reasons for the attraction. You know, I look good with him, you know, I look good with her.
If we think about Lee Harvey, he's going to be dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, making them laugh, having a bit of a laugh with them, carrying a degree of authority. He's a big, attractive guy. Tracie Andrews, she's working bars, she's dealing with the punters, she's making them laugh, she's flirting and being outgoing. Both of them are quite extrovert personalities, and then they find one another. And it certainly seems to be the case that they're both intensely attracted to one another.
Tracie and Lee's relationship was intense from the start. Within weeks, Lee was spending most of his time at Tracie's flat in Aftershock.
Tracie also had a young daughter called Carla, who was a similar age to Lee's daughter. So when Lee and Tracie met, he was very happy in the circumstances he found himself. He wanted to settle down and get married and have more children. They were engaged within about 6 months, and he'd moved in with her into her flat.
But Lee's parents, in particular his mother, had reservations about the relationship.
Maureen was very suspicious because Tracie was quite brassy, slightly older than Lee, who was introduced to them as his future bride. She didn't put on an act for the family. She was very much take me as I am. She didn't disguise her kind of quite volatile personality. Lee's mum said that she thought that Lee was in lust and not love, but he confused the two. Lee was very close to his mum, and quite unusually close to his mum in that he would talk about his sex life with his mum. He would say that Tracie would be waiting for him dressed up in suspenders as soon as he got home from work, and was quite demanding in bed and all that kind of thing. So I think she knew how to hook a man in, but unfortunately she couldn't quite cope with any kind of disagreement or any kind of conflict, and it would escalate.
The foundation of the relationship in many ways on both parts was an element of jealousy. They didn't like attention being given to the other partner, and they didn't like the other partner receiving any attention from others. And when that happened, that caused intense arguments and problems in the relationship.
Neighbours, would say that, they might as well not have their rows inside four doors. They might as well have them on the drive because they could hear every word. Every word. Above all, Tracie, who would scream invective in a sort of stream, as if she never even paused for breath.
Lee would throw things around the room, and she would fight back and hit him and punch him. And the police were quite often called out, and he would go off to back to his mum's, basically back to stay with his parents. But she would always phone up a few days later and beg forgiveness and get him back. And he would go back. I mean, he was completely obsessed with her.
He was infatuated with her. I think the expression was, by both of them, can't live with you, can't live without you. Mrs. Harvey did her best to warn her son off, but it was hopeless.
They were in this sort of cycle of, it's all gone, so yeah, let's move on, and then couldn't move on, came back round to it again sort of thing, and on it went again.
They had this terrible, terrible attraction for each other, and they kept on boomeranging back together again, and then the same situation would resolve.
For many who knew the couple, the volatility of the relationship indicated difficulties down the line. But no one could foresee what would happen on the night of December the 1st, 1996.
I've seen some things, but I've never seen anyone stabbed as significantly and as repeatedly as that.
On the day of the incident, their neighbours had heard the couple arguing and throwing things around, which was quite a regular occurrence.
It had been just a typical, non-stop bicker, and then it would explode, and then it would simmer, and then it would explode. And one or other of them suggested that they should go out for a sort of mid-evening to late evening drink together, just change of scene, try and break it, I think, try and break the mood. But it clearly wasn't working, it didn't work. They were in the pub together, they were sulky with each other, monosyllabic, barely talking, barely acknowledging each other.
They were extremely unhappy, the pair of them. There were witnesses in the pub who just knew from the atmosphere at that table that these two people were in the course of quite a serious dispute.
At about 10:30, Lee and Tracie decided to head home.
They left the public house. They drove out onto the main A38 towards Bromsgrove when this vehicle that's following them and started flashing its lights, sounding its horn and tailgating them down the main road.
She was looking in the glove compartment for a CD and didn't see the beginning of the action. But what she became aware of was that Lee was suddenly driving erratically and shouting abuse at someone and looking in his rear-view mirror.
They carry on along into the back lanes towards Old Church, where a sort of race develops.
Lee was now driving kind of cat and mouse and was accelerating and then slowing and accelerating and then slowing, and there was a car behind swerving and doing the kind of Formula One thing, looking as if to get past.
They turn up towards Cooper's Hill, and as they get nearly towards the top, this vehicle, which he later described as a F-registered dark-coloured Ford Sierra, overtook them and pulled in front of them.
And then screeched to a halt, brake lights on, and now both drivers are out of the cars and haranguing each other in the middle of this darkened lane.
Then the passenger got out from the passenger side, came over and began to punch him repeatedly and punch him to the ground.
She sees blows being rained on him. She thinks that it's a fist, but he's not aware. She says that he's being stabbed.
She goes to get in the way of this and gets, she says, this injury to her eye. She believes she may have been knocked out for a while. When she hears the driver then shout to this passenger to come on, and the vehicle tears away. And as she sort of comes back to her senses, she sees Lee lying in the road and he's bleeding heavily. And she tries to go to his assistance by nursing him and cradling him in her arms.
A man heard her screaming and ran out of a nearby house to find Tracie standing by the car with Lee on the ground. The man took Tracie inside and called the police.
I was the duty SIO on that night and got a call at home about 12 midnight or thereabouts to say this had occurred by Off Church. And so I attended the scene. When I arrived, obviously the main inner scene was cordoned off. But I could see Lee Harvey's car parked near to the gateway of Keeper's Cottage. Lee's body was still in situ towards the rear of the vehicle. Tracie Andrews was still at Keeper's Cottage, still inside, but I didn't get to see her on that night at all. She went off in an ambulance, and then obviously I waited for the other resources to arrive, crime scene management, pathologist, and a forensic science officer. I've seen some things, but I've never seen anyone stabbed as significantly and as repeatedly as that. I mean, when we counted them up at post-mortem, there were 42. And of those, he had those on his back, his head, and in the neck. The damage to his throat was immense. I've never seen anything like it.
Tracie was taken to hospital. She had minor facial injuries and she was in shock. She was detained overnight and then was under police protection. Clearly, there are two madmen out there who stop at nothing and who hadn't taken the opportunity to kill her on that night, but might think it best to do so. So she's being looked after by the police.
In the early hours of the morning, Detective Brian Russell went to Worcester Hospital and took a statement from Tracie.
Tracie said they'd been involved in a road rage incident and that a fat man with staring eyes had stabbed Lee to death. So the police put out an appeal for witnesses to see if anyone had seen the Black Sierra, if anyone had witnessed any kind of incident involving those two cars, Lee's car and this black car. And nobody came forward, nobody had seen anything.
And so then they start to go round the route with it to know step by step where things happened along the route. So we then started organising searches for the weapon with some house to house then, that whatever properties came along after the event.
And then the story takes an extraordinary twist because the police announce the following day that they're going to have a press conference and Tracie is going to be there.
If we got these shenanigans with a white car very definitely speeding down that road followed by a dark car, it really ought to stand out in somebody's memory that they will have seen this going along. So that was what was paramount to me to get the press conference. I hadn't been briefed as to who was attending, and I have to say I was somewhat surprised when I walked into the room to find it had got as much national coverage as it had.
Very quickly, the phrase that came out was road rage. And road rage these days seems just a commonplace occurrence, but in those days, not at all. It was a new phenomenon that people could get so upset with each other about some driving incident that they would get out of their cars and attack each other. And this was apparently the first road rage murder, at which point it instantly became, in news terms, stratospheric. And very, very quickly, we're all gathered, a big press pack are gathered at Redditch police station.
That got a huge amount of media attention because, you know, there was this very sort of beaten up girl with two black eyes and a cut above her eye, and her hair was all kind of matted and in a very distressed state and appealing for witnesses. You know, her partner had just been murdered, and so it was all over the front pages.
Both Lee and the other person were like playing cat and mouse with each other for a while. I got out of the car and then I went over to the man. We had a confrontation and he hit me. I can't remember. I fell to the floor. I can't remember if I was knocked out for a bit or what, I don't know.
I think the whole of Britain was completely taken in by her. You know, what a tragedy it was, you know, to a young couple on the way home from a night out being attacked like this.
The driver walked off. It was nothing to do with the driver. And all I want to say is, please, will the driver of the car just come forward, because you are not to blame for this, and I know that.
But then during the press conference, Tracie said something that caught the attention of everyone in the room.
I said, so, Tracie, I'm really sorry that for your predicament here, but we have to ask you some questions. I gather that you left the pub at about 10 to 10 last night. And she said, no, it was 10 past. And I thought I'd screwed up. I thought I'd misheard or misremembered. I thought I got it wrong, and my mind is racing here. I'm speaking on behalf of the assembled print journalists, and apparently I've got it wrong. And I said, sorry, I could have sworn that yesterday the police said it was 10 to, and she said, no, 10 past. And I thought, we've got 20 minutes gone missing here. And then suddenly, I'm aware that Superintendent Ian Johnston, the senior investigating officer, his head turns in slow motion, like this. I mean, it was extraordinary. And he stared at her. And it became clear to me that I hadn't got it wrong, I got it right. She changed her account.
Our understanding was that they'd left the public house somewhere towards 10 o'clock. And of course she hadn't been found in the road until at least gone sort of 11 or so. And clearly you're talking about no more than, probably at the speed she alleges, a 10-minute journey. So we're missing a fair chunk of time.
Police began to look at the whole incident in a different light. The investigation was now heading down a different path. and what was about to emerge would shock the investigators and the public.
You know, are people thinking, well, this is a young woman, can we really believe that she's done this sort of thing? I did ask straight out from the start when I first saw both sets of parents, how had these two young people been getting on? And I understood, I got the answer, well, they've had their ups and downs like everybody else, you know, but when we got further into the inquiry and started looking into the background, we found that Tracie had assaulted Lee on a couple of occasions previously. At one stage, she'd struck him with a bottle in a nightclub in Birmingham. She'd bitten him.
It was a very public display of violence quite a lot of the time, you know. It was so passionate that they couldn't control themselves, even in public. There was an incident in a nightclub about a month before Lee was murdered when he was chatting to a barmaid and Tracie flew into a rage and bit him on the neck and then also punched him twice, and there were witnesses to these attacks.
I think it's said by another partner that jealousness, possessiveness and violence is part of her character, that had been part of her character for quite some time.
As they looked into Tracie and Lee's past, police discovered a secret that had surely put a strain on their relationship in recent times.
Tracie got pregnant, and for a while they were happy about it, they were looking forward to it, but I think their relationship was still quite unstable. And when she was about 4 months pregnant, she came back one day and said, "Oh, I've fallen over and had a miscarriage. I've lost the baby." And everyone was very upset because everyone thought, "Oh, this will be the glue that sticks them together if they have a child together." So she lost the baby, and she lost a lot of weight. And I think Lee thought that must have been the trauma from the miscarriage. And she lost of weight, and she said to him, my boobs have got smaller. I'd really like you to pay for a breast enhancement, which he did. So he paid for that. And then it transpired that she'd actually had an abortion. Nobody really knows why, but I'm guessing that she kind of thought, Lee's gonna walk out on me and I'll be left with 2 kids on my own. So it's not, I don't want to go through with it.
Police were keeping a close eye on Tracie as the investigation was developing. 3 days after the murder, Detective Brian Russell went to her house to speak with her, but he wasn't expecting what was waiting for him when he arrived.
Her mother said, "Oh, she's resting, she's upstairs, I think." And of course Brian went up, and of course he found her then unconscious. And then it was realised that she'd taken a fair dose of tablets. And from that point on, she was taken into hospital. And from then, we didn't speak to her in the same light again. As she's in hospital, the events turn that make her become the suspect in the case rather than the witness in the case.
Yet another subplot developed to this extraordinary story. Tracie took an overdose and was rushed off to hospital. In the meantime, a pair of accountants, a man and a woman, a couple, who'd been on the lanes that night, driving, as it happened, the precise reverse route to the route that Lee and Tracie were taking. They came out with some really interesting evidence. And the evidence they came out is that they came down Cooper's Hill, going the other way, nothing happening there at that time, and they came to a T-junction at the bottom, and Lee's really distinctive car, this white Escort RS 2000, came screaming up the lanes from their right, and overshot the junction and screeched to a halt, brake lights on. And they were due to turn right, and wanted to turn right, which they did. And the male who was driving looked in his rearview mirror and saw Lee's car reverse back, screech to a halt, to a hard left, up Cooper's Hill, and continue that way. They, meantime, were going in exactly retracing in the opposite direction, Lee and Tracie's tyre tracks. No sign of a pursuing car, none at all, no other car.
So that was when the whole psychology of the case changed and the police became deeply suspicious. Then came the forensics, and wherever the police looked at the forensics, it did not match her account. The geography of where the attack had occurred, as described by Tracie Andrews, was not borne out by where the blood was on the road and on the car that they were in.
The car was actually quite neatly parked right against what would be its near side curb coming from the direction that it had been travelling out of Bromsgrove. And the gateway into Keeper's Cottage was more or less in line with the bumper of the vehicle. To all intents and purposes, it looked as though it had just sort of gradually pulled into a halt on the edge of the green strip. One of our officers was talking with the householder. She happened then to talk to her children about this, and that's when her daughter came to the fact that she got up to go to the toilet that night, and although she hadn't seen anything, she'd heard voices in the lane outside. She'd heard a male and a female voice, and that's all she heard, one male, one female, and it was angry.
One loud like a man's, one soft like a woman's, not two men's voices. She can't distinguish what's being said, but it's a man's and a woman's voice, and that proved to be crucial evidence which came from this 9-year-old girl.
Found adjacent to where the passenger would have got out of the Phantom Sierra was a woolly hat, and which she was implying must have come from the passenger.
Obviously, we sent that for an immediate investigation with a view towards hair and DNA and all that sort of thing. And we came back with the fact that this was black and white animal hair. And in fact, we realised that Tracie had a black and white cat. And we did go down and take a sample of hair from the cat. And it was totally in accord with the cat.
You have to picture that she must have put that hat there, thinking through how she was going to corroborate the existence of non-existent people.
One piece of forensic evidence in particular confirmed the doubts about Tracie's version of events on the night.
The blood on her clothing categorically refuted the account she'd given. Her account was she had got that on her when she was comforting Lee Harvey in his dying moments on the road.
The arms of her sweater sort of went with that, you know, it was saturated blood. He said, but there's an awful lot of blood splattering as well, an awful lot of being close to when Lee Harvey's blood was actually flying around under pressure. And he said that really puts her close to him when his neck has been punctured.
So all the blood is down the front of her jumper in streams. It's not smeared from holding him. It streams and drops coming from the fountainhead of blood in which she was standing as she stabbed him.
When we got to the post-mortem, well, the pathologist found what was considered a reasonably big clump of hair in Lee's hand, blonde hair. And of course, realistically, it could only have come from Tracie. It was long blonde hair.
And on her jacket, stuck there in blood, was a whole hank of her hair. So that was another forensic aspect which showed he'd been fighting her, and in fact trying to fight her off. He wasn't being comforted by her.
This evidence and the fact that nothing was emerging from public appeals meant Tracie was now rapidly becoming the centre of police inquiries.
She had let her temper run riot. He almost certainly was telling her he thought the relationship should come to an end. She was not going to accept it, and she resorted to violence. But she resorted to violence of the most extreme kind. It is a sustained armed attack of 30, 40 blows with a knife all over the body, the face, the neck in particular, one in the back. It's not just one wild thrust in a red-hot moment of anger.
She really must have lost all thought. I think for that moment in time, you know, whatever had driven it beyond, you know. In fact, it nearly took his throat out, poor devil.
But one piece of vital evidence was missing: the murder weapon that had left Lee with multiple stab wounds. The autopsy gave police a clue to the type of weapon they should be looking for.
As the pathologist told us later, was that there were actual blade injuries, but there were also double wounds, which she said at that time was significant with scissors.
They had done the most extensive search with men on their hands and knees for hours on a very wide radius around where it had happened. Nothing. All they ever found was a tiny little spring and another little piece on the road that was consistent with having been in a Swiss Army penknife. That was it. There was no weapon ever recovered. And the police were very concerned about the failure to find it.
Despite the absence of a murder weapon, investigators had come to a decision about their next course of action.
We made up our mind that there was sufficient evidence to arrest her. We arrested her on the Saturday morning. We had the police surgeon on standby immediately to see her as she came into custody. The doctor came in and said, no, you can't keep her. She's got to go to psychiatric hospital. So we were precluded from any form of interview on that date. And she went off to Rayside Clinic, where she spent at least a week. When she came out, we interviewed her, obviously. No comment interview. And so that was it. We were left with what we got. And so the custody officer made the decision there was sufficient prima facie evidence for us to charge her. So we charged her with murder. We took her to Reddish Magistrates Court, where she was remanded in custody, and went to Earl Stoke. And then the defence made an application for Judge in Chambers bail. And quite surprisingly, she was admitted to bail.
Although police were sure they had their murderer, it seemed that things were not going to be as straightforward as they should have been.
This was a well-thought-through, sophisticated defence by a very accomplished liar.
The trial began on the 1st of July 1997 as the whole country looked on.
I think it began with enormous sympathy for her, and that began to evaporate as the evidence began to emerge into the public domain. Once she was emerging as a suspect, then charged, and then due to be tried for murder, as an exercise in assessing objectively the strength of the case, it didn't start as a particularly strong case. And I have no doubt at all that from the defence point of view, that they believed that they had an excellent prospect of her being acquitted.
The trial was a huge media event. It was a circus every morning when Tracie, wearing some other outfit, some new, dolled up to the nines, would walk into court flanked typically by her stepfather on one side and by her flamboyant solicitor on the other side. And there would be this huge media circus as they pitched up at court every day. TV cameras, press photographers.
And she stood on the steps, surrounded by photographers, and smiled at them, and was really quite calm as a cucumber. She didn't look like a guilty woman who was about to be put on trial. She really was quite the consummate actress.
The events in the courtroom also played out like a theatre performance, with intense rivalry between both prosecution and defence teams and families.
The defence and prosecuting counsel in this case detested each other, absolutely loathed each other, and they made no bones about it.
The camps were so heavily divided. Mr. and Mrs. Harvey, and Mrs. Harvey perhaps more than Mr. Harvey, could not get over the enormity of the treachery and betrayal that was involved in this. And her feelings towards this woman were extremely intense, and that showed. But equally, on the Tracie Andrews side, there was hostility and enmity showed towards the Harvey family. This was a real battle lines drawn, and the atmosphere permeated the courtroom throughout the length of the trial.
Despite all the forensic evidence they had against Tracie Andrews, the lack of a murder weapon caused a major concern for the prosecution team.
If Tracie was the killer, she had not left the scene. So where was the murder weapon if the murder weapons left the scene, who has transported it away? It was just crucial to work this thing out.
But then, after Tracie was arrested and they analysed her clothing, she had a pair of mock crocodile patent leather ankle boots that they looked at, and they found the imprint of a knife on the inside of the boot, and it was shown to the court. It was quite a clear imprint. It was a bloody imprint, basically. And when they analysed the blood, there was a mixture of Tracie and Lee's blood.
But she had quite a good explanation for that. Her hands were covered in blood, and at the hospital she'd had to remove her boots. The blood is still sticky and wet, and she would have put her thumb or finger down the side of the boot to remove it. So that was her answer to that.
And I just remember sitting in the court and they showed a picture of this imprint to the jury, and it was a very clear outline of a knife. It couldn't be anything other than a knife.
The prosecution had developed a theory on what may have happened to the weapon.
When Tracie was taken to hospital, she went to the toilet and she kept going in and out to the loo all the time, and the nurses were slightly suspicious.
Maybe one thinks, well, we shouldn't have allowed her to do that, but everything's up in the air at that time. You know, the officers who went with her, their sympathies are probably out with her. You know, they're not looking at this girl as sort of like the murderer at that time. They're thinking, blimey, she's had a rough old do. You know, she wants the loo. You would, wouldn't you?
I think the thinking is that she either flushed the knife down the toilet or put it in one of the hospital bins, which was then emptied and taken away.
The other theory is that somehow she spirited it away. Various people visited her. She wasn't under suspicion. She was being treated. She was free. Visited her in the hours at the hospital. There were opportunities there.
The police theory on the disposal of the weapon remained supposition, so with no definite evidence of the removal of the weapon, the prosecution team put all of their efforts into the cross-examination of Tracie Andrews. It was this stage of the trial that would make or break the case for them.
She sticks pretty much to her first account with some modifications, but she gives her account. David Krigman rises to his feet and he takes the rest of that day and the whole of the next day and into the next day. This is a 3-day demolition of Tracie's account.
I fell to the floor. I can't remember if I was knocked out for a bit or what, I don't know.
You have to picture what happened in this case. In a cold December night, in the blackness of a country lane, where if you stand there at night, you can't see but a few yards. In that setting, she'd done a man to death. He was lying dead or dying in the road. She was covered in his blood, and yet within seconds or a minute, she is constructing a considered and plausible defence, which fooled quite a lot of people, certainly for the early stages. This was a well thought through, sophisticated defence by a very accomplished liar.
I had throughout the trial kept an open mind about the way I thought it would go, and it always hangs on cross-examination in the witness box with the suspect saying their piece, and how do they stand up to that under scrutiny? How does the story stand up? How do they stand up to it? And he just took her story apart. And she was left in the end saying, I don't know. I can't remember.
I think one of the things is that when people get caught in a lie, it's very easy to give the basic details of the lie. The basic story, this is a bald-headed man with piercing blue eyes who I'd remember in a car. The basics of it, absolutely fine. When you then start to scrutinise that with any real depth, when you start to take it apart, that becomes problematic. You know, for one, the person who's telling the lie has to remember the details that they've given previously. And that's quite a task, you know. The more that people talk as well, the more that information that they put out, the more likely it is that they will make those statements that contradict them. And I think because Tracie Andrews liked attention, because she liked to be the centre of attention, she wasn't capable of thinking, actually what I really ought to do is to back off and say as little as possible. That quite freely she got caught in the lie. She played up to that. Here, I'm at the centre of things, and so I'll say a little bit more, I'll give more detail.
After the cross-examination, she left the witness box, resumed her place in the dock. Everybody watched her, everybody's eyes as she, Ray and Maureen Harvey there, just looking through her. And everybody knew at that point that she'd blown it. It was gone. Guilty verdict. I carried out the Daily Mirror's exclusive interview with Tracie Andrews on her final minutes of freedom. And I just about got to the end of my questions. She was sat there in her cream jacket, dressed up to the nines as she'd been every day for court, nicely made up, hair beautifully done. She was calm, she was collected. The jury had been out overnight and the tannoy went, and it went, all parties to court 9, all parties to court 9. And the judge said to her, the sentence I pass on you, is that required by law? Life imprisonment. Down the steps she went.
When she finally got sent to prison, the story came out that she told all her inmates that she was now more famous than Princess Diana. Whether that's true or not, nobody really knows because it's impossible to verify, but it kind of rings true because she was all over the media, she was famous, she was definitely, it was her 5 minutes of fame.
I was particularly pleased from the point of view of Ray and Maureen Harvey that we were able to get to the bottom of it. They've had this horrendous moment in their life. They've lost a dear son. Their daughter's lost a dear brother, and it's brought some amount of closure to it. I think you also lose sight of the fact that Tracie had a family. And, her mum had to go through some hoops, realistically, to believe that her daughter was involved in this. I mean, there's no doubt Tracie did it because she wrote afterwards and admitted it prior to her sentencing. So she has eventually admitted that it was her, albeit that there's been no close questioning of that outline. We've had to take it sort of, this is what she says and that's the end of it.
Police finally got their answers on what had happened to the murder weapon when Tracie eventually confessed.
She still stood by the story. It had not been in the boot, but it had been in her underclothing, and then she'd got rid of it through the lavatory system.
Since she was released in July 2011, having served 14 years, Tracie has remarried and lives somewhere on the south coast of England.
I think most women would have probably admitted to doing it, but pleaded self-defense, that she was a battered woman. The police had been called out several times during their relationship to domestic incidents at their house. So maybe it was true. Maybe he had attacked her. I mean, she said later in interviews that he was the one who pulled the knife on her and threatened to disfigure her so that no man would ever fancy her. But I think she was just very arrogant and self-obsessed and narcissistic, and I think basically she probably couldn't admit to herself that she'd done it, never mind to the police or to anyone else.
Only Tracie Andrews knows what really happened on the night of the 1st of December, 1996.
The public remember her as the woman who knifed to death her partner in an incredibly brutal offence and then got caught in this elaborate lie, telling it over and over again, and then the massive fall from grace that came with that as well.
I think Tracie thought she got away with it. There was no murder weapon, but a murderer always leaves a trace.